Drenched in sweat, Ethan jolted awake, heart pounding like a war drum. The sharp, metallic scent of blood filled the air. In the dim light of the hotel room, he could see his wife, Sarah, sitting on the edge of the bed, staring blankly at her trembling hands. They were covered in thick, crimson blood. "Sarah, what did you do?" His voice cracked as dread crawled up his spine. She didn't respond. She didn't move. Ethan's pulse quickened as he shot up from the bed, frantically scanning the room for signs of an intruder, anything that could explain this nightmare. The hotel room was eerily still, except for the rhythmic, haunting drip of blood falling from Sarah's hands onto the floor. A sense of suffocating dread settled over him, like the very walls of the hotel were watching, waiting. 48 hours earlier, Ethan and Sarah had checked into the Redwood Hotel for a weekend getaway, an attempt to mend their fractured marriage. The hotel was old, charming in a way, with dark wood paneling and vintage decor that whispered of a bygone era. Nestled deep in the mountains, it offered the isolation they needed. Or so they thought. From the moment they stepped into the lobby, Ethan felt uneasy. The air was thick, heavy with something he couldn't place. The receptionist, an older woman with unsettlingly wide eyes, handed them the key to room 503, offering them a cryptic smile that lingered far too long. "Enjoy your stay," she said, her voice like a whisper through gritted teeth. As they walked toward the elevator, Ethan felt a chill snake down his spine. The place was beautiful, sure, but there was something off. The kind of off that tickles the back of your mind and gnaws at your gut, telling you to leave. But he ignored it. After all, they were here to relax. The first night was peaceful. Too peaceful. Sarah slept soundly beside him, her steady breathing filling the silence. But Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching them. His eyes darted to the corner of the room, where the shadows seemed unnaturally dark, almost too thick, like they had weight. He swore he saw movement, just for a second, but when he blinked, the corner was still. Unable to sleep, Ethan got up and padded to the bathroom. The cold tiles beneath his feet sent a jolt through him as he flicked on the light. For a moment, he thought he saw something in the mirror, a dark figure standing behind him. His heart leapt into his throat, but when he turned around, there was nothing. Just the empty, quiet room. The second night. That was when the nightmares started. Ethan woke, breathless, drenched in sweat, as if he'd been running from something unseen. In his dreams, there was always a door that led to nowhere but darkness, and from behind it, he heard a voice. A whisper, calling his name. "Ethan, come find me." The voice chilled him to the core. It was familiar, yet distorted, like someone he loved had been twisted beyond recognition. The next morning, Sarah was distant, her eyes dark and hollow. She barely spoke over breakfast, and when Ethan asked if she was okay, she brushed him off, blaming it on poor sleep. That night, things escalated. Sarah started sleepwalking, her eyes wide but unseeing. She wandered through the room, whispering incoherently under her breath. Ethan tried to wake her, but it was like she was in a trance, her fingers brushing the walls as if she were searching for something hidden within them. "Sarah, wake up." Ethan grabbed her by the shoulders, shaking her gently, but her body went rigid, her head snapping toward him with a sickening crack. Her eyes, once warm and loving, were now cold, glassy, like someone else was looking out from behind them. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice distant and hollow. "It's here." The final night. Ethan knew something was wrong with the hotel. Room 503 wasn't normal. There was something inside, something that had its claws in Sarah, dragging her deeper into its twisted grip. Desperation gnawed at his insides as he watched her spiral into madness. That night, she didn't sleep. She just sat at the foot of the bed, her eyes locked on the door to the hallway, as if waiting for something to come through. "What are you waiting for?" Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. "They're coming," she replied, her voice eerily calm. "They've been waiting." The door to the hallway creaked open, slowly, unnaturally, but no one was there. Only darkness. Thick, suffocating darkness that spilled into the room like a living thing. Suddenly, Sarah stood, her movements jerky and unnatural, as if she were a puppet on strings. She began walking toward the open door, her eyes vacant, her expression blank. "Sarah, stop." Ethan lunged for her, but his legs felt like lead, his movements sluggish, as though the air itself was thick with unseen hands holding him back. As Sarah reached the doorway, a figure stepped out of the darkness, an impossibly tall man, his face obscured by shadow, his eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He reached out to Sarah, his long, bony fingers wrapping around her arm. "No!" Ethan screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the thick air, disappearing into the void. The man smiled, a grotesque, lipless grin that stretched too wide for a human face. And in that moment, Ethan realized the horrifying truth. The hotel wanted Sarah, and now it wanted him too. With a sudden jolt, the figure yanked Sarah into the darkness, and the door slammed shut with a deafening thud. Ethan stumbled forward, his heart hammering in his chest, and threw open the door only to find an empty hallway. No Sarah, no figure, just silence. The next morning, Ethan found himself standing in front of the reception desk, disheveled and broken. "My wife, she's gone," he whispered, his voice hoarse. The receptionist's eyes flickered with recognition, but her expression remained blank. "Room 503, she said softly, shaking her head. "You were the only guest, Mr. Harper." Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. "Your wife never checked in." The first time Lucas saw her, he was entranced. The woman stood at the far end of the hotel bar, bathed in soft, amber light, her dark eyes shimmering with a dangerous allure. Dressed in vintage black velvet, she had the look of someone who belonged to another time, someone whose beauty was ageless. Lucas had checked into the Carlton Manor for a week, a temporary escape from the mess his life had become. A high-powered attorney on the verge of burnout, he craved solitude, but in that moment, all he craved was her. Lucas had checked into the Carlton Manor for a week. Her lips curled into a knowing smile, and she beckoned him with a single glance. His pulse quickened, and despite the voice in the back of his mind, screaming, "Don't go," Lucas stood and walked toward her, the distance between them shrinking as the air thickened with an almost tangible tension. By the time he reached her, she had already turned and was heading for the stairs. There was no introduction, no conversation, just the quiet, intoxicating pull of her presence. Something inside him felt wrong, as if he were being led toward something dangerous, but he couldn't stop. His curiosity had gripped him in a way he hadn't felt in years. As she disappeared around the corner, heading for the upper floors, Lucas snapped back to reality. He stopped, his heart pounding, his mind a battlefield of temptation and fear. This isn't right. His hand twitched as if to reach for her, but then he froze. He didn't even know her name. Turning away, Lucas forced himself back to his hotel room, his thoughts racing. She was beautiful, yes, but there was something unsettling about her. Her eyes, they had been too dark, too deep, like they hid something more than just mystery. He pushed the thoughts aside, told himself he was being ridiculous. But when he finally slipped into bed, sleep did not come easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. The next morning, Lucas felt restless. The woman haunted his thoughts, but he told himself it was just a fleeting infatuation. He was alone in a strange hotel, his mind wandering. That's all it was. But as the day wore on, he couldn't escape the feeling that someone was watching him. In the hallways, the elevator, even the hotel lobby, He kept catching glimpses of her. Not directly, never close enough to confront, but always just beyond his line of sight. A flash of black velvet disappearing around a corner, a reflection of dark eyes in a distant mirror. That night, as he lay in bed, sleep once again evaded him. The silence in the hotel was too thick, pressing down on him like a weight. Then, just past midnight, there came a sound. A soft knock at the door. Lucas sat up, heart thudding in his chest. For a moment, he thought he had imagined it, but then it came again. This time, more urgent. He slipped out of bed and padded to the door, opening it cautiously. No one was there. But something wasn't right. The air in the hallway was colder, and a faint scent of perfume lingered in the air. The same scent he had noticed on her the night before. It was sweet but cloying, almost suffocating. His eyes scanned the empty hallway, but he saw nothing. Just as he was about to close the door, a faint whisper brushed his ear. "Come to me, Lucas." His blood ran cold. The voice was soft, delicate, but laced with a sinister edge that sent shivers down his spine. He slammed the door shut and stumbled back to the bed, his pulse racing. He wasn't imagining this. She was real. The days that followed were an agonizing descent into paranoia. The woman began appearing more frequently. He would catch her reflection in mirrors when no one was there, hear her soft voice whispering his name when he was alone in his room. She had become a constant presence, haunting his every moment, but no one else seemed to notice her. He tried to leave the hotel, packed his bags, booked a flight, but when he reached the lobby, he couldn't do it. The thought of leaving filled him with a strange, unshakable fear. The moment he set foot outside, he felt a pull, an invisible thread yanking him back inside. The hotel had become a cage, and he was its prisoner. That night, he saw her again, this time standing at the foot of his bed. Her dark eyes gleamed with an unnatural hunger, and her lips parted in a slow, predatory smile. "Why are you doing this to me?" he demanded, his voice breaking. "You know why," she whispered, her voice low and intoxicating. "You want this." Lucas's mind was reeling, trying to understand. Part of him did want her, wanted the mystery, the danger. But another part of him, the rational part, screamed at him to run, to break free of whatever hold she had over him. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice shaking. Her smile widened, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too pointed. "I am what you fear most," she said. "I am what you cannot escape." That night, she came for him. Lucas woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the air in the room thick with an overwhelming sense of dread. The woman stood at the edge of the bed, her eyes glowing with a sickening light. This time, there was no seduction, no pretense. "I'm tired of waiting," she whispered, her voice cold and merciless. Lucas scrambled out of bed, his heart racing. "Stay away from me," he shouted, his voice shaking with terror. But she didn't move. Her form seemed to shift, her beauty warping into something grotesque and monstrous. Her eyes were black voids, endless and hungry, and her once perfect skin stretched unnaturally tight over her face. "You've been mine since the moment you walked in," she hissed. "There's no escaping this." Lucas's mind raced. He wasn't a fool. He had to find a way out. But every step he took toward the door felt like walking through thick, suffocating air. The walls of the hotel seemed to close in on him, pressing him toward her. She was closer now, her fingers long, clawed, and unnaturally sharp, reaching for him. Desperation clawed at his mind. He turned and ran toward the window, yanking it open. But outside, there was nothing. No street, no city, just endless, black void. "I told you," she whispered from behind him. "There's no escape." The next morning, the maid found Lucas in room 217. The room was untouched, everything perfectly in place. But Lucas laid in the center of the bed, his body rigid, his face twisted in a mask of terror. His eyes were wide open, staring at nothing, his skin cold and gray. They never found a cause of death, just like they hadn't for the other guests who had stayed in room 217 over the decades. But when they removed his body, the smell of sweet, suffocating perfume lingered in the air. And if you listen closely, late at night, you can still hear her soft voice drifting through the halls. "Come to me." The Johnson family arrived at the old Lancaster Hotel, excited for their weekend getaway. Nestled deep in the mountains, the hotel promised a cozy retreat from their busy city life. Claire, the mother, had chosen the location for its quiet charm. Her husband, Mark, wasn't one for long vacations, but he had agreed for the sake of their two children, Ella and Sam, who were eager for adventure. As they pulled up to the grand towering structure, the hotel loomed over them, its worn Gothic architecture bathed in the fading light of the evening. "Wow," Ella whispered, staring up at the building, her eyes wide. "It's huge." Mark forced a smile. "Let's just hope it looks as good on the inside." But Claire felt it. Something was wrong. A subtle gnawing unease crept into her stomach. She brushed it off as nerves from the long drive. But deep down, the hotel's empty windows seemed to stare back at her with an almost malicious intent. The moment they stepped inside, the air seemed to change. The lobby was eerily quiet, and the dim lighting did little to make the vast space feel welcoming. It felt heavy, as if the very air was suffocating. A chill ran down Claire's spine, but she pushed the feeling aside, focusing on the excited chatter of her children. That night, after settling into their suite on the 4th floor, Claire sat by the window, watching as the night blanketed the mountains. There was something about the silence that unnerved her. No crickets, no wind, nothing. Just silence. "Mom, this place is creepy," Sam said, his voice low as he peeked out from the bathroom. He was 9, but had always been sensitive to his surroundings, easily picking up on things others ignored. "It's just an old building, sweetheart. It has character," Claire replied, though she didn't believe her own words. As Mark unpacked their things, Claire noticed Ella standing by the doorway of their room, staring into the hallway. Her small frame was rigid, her back to them, unmoving. "Ella?" Claire called softly. "What are you doing?" Ella didn't respond. Claire's stomach twisted. She got up and walked toward her daughter, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. When Ella finally turned to face her, her eyes were wide, and her face was pale. "There's a man in the hallway, Mom," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's watching us." Claire's blood ran cold. She peered out into the hallway, expecting to see someone. A guest, perhaps, but it was empty. Her heart hammered in her chest. "There's no one there, honey," Claire said softly, trying to keep her voice steady. "It's late. You're tired. Let's get to bed." Ella didn't argue, but Claire could see the fear still etched in her daughter's face. As they tucked the kids in, Claire and Mark exchanged worried glances. Something was off, but neither of them wanted to admit it yet. The following night, things got worse. The tension in the room was palpable, thick and oppressive. That same heavy silence clung to the walls, as if the air itself was watching them. Claire woke to the sound of whispering, faint and almost indiscernible, but it was there like voices murmuring just beyond the reach of her hearing. Her heart pounded in her chest as she strained to listen. Slowly, she slid out of bed, careful not to wake Mark, and crept toward the door of their suite. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. She opened the door to the hallway, but it was empty, save for the dim, flickering lights that lined the WA Laos. "Who's there?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Nothing. Just that oppressive, suffocating silence. As Claire turned to go back inside, she froze. A shadow stood at the end of the hall, just beyond the reach of the light. A man, tall and still. He didn't move, didn't breathe. He just stood there, watching. A scream lodged in her throat, but she couldn't make a sound. She blinked, and he was gone. Claire rushed back into the room, slamming the door behind her. Her hands shook as she tried to convince herself that she had imagined it, that the darkness was playing tricks on her. But deep down, she knew better. The third night is when the nightmare started. The family had been sitting in the room, trying to shake off the tension that seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. Claire noticed that the children had become quieter, their usual bickering and playfulness replaced by a tense silence. Sam was sitting in the corner, his eyes wide as he stared at the floor, refusing to speak. Ella sat on the edge of the bed, her hands gripping her knees tightly, her knuckles white. "Mom," Ella's voice trembled as she spoke. "There's someone in the room." Mark glanced at her, his brow furrowing. "Ella, stop it now." "No, Dad," she insisted, her voice cracking. "He's here. He's watching us." Claire's heart raced. She turned to Mark, and for the first time, she saw the same fear reflected in his eyes. This wasn't just a child's imagination. Something was wrong. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the temperature in the room plummeted. Claire's breath came out in short, visible puffs, and the oppressive silence returned, even heavier than before. The air felt charged, electric, as if something was waiting just beyond the edge of their perception. The whispers began again, louder this time, angrier. Mark stood up abruptly, his eyes wild. "We need to get out of here." But as soon as he reached for the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The room felt like it was closing in on them, the walls vibrating as if the very foundation of the hotel was alive, pulsating with malevolent energy. "Mom!" Sam screamed, tears streaming down his face. "Make it stop!" Claire rushed to her son, pulling him into her arms, her heart breaking at the fear in his voice. Ella huddled next to her, sobbing uncontrollably, but Mark was paralyzed. His eyes were fixed on something unseen, his face pale, his mouth open in horror. He took a step back, shaking his head. "I can feel him," Mark whispered, his voice hollow. "He's here, inside me." Claire's stomach dropped. "What are you talking about?" Mark's body convulsed, his hands shaking violently. His eyes rolled back into his head, and a guttural, inhuman growl escaped his throat. Claire screamed, backing away with the children. Mark, stop!" But Mark wasn't there anymore. With a violent jolt, he collapsed to the floor, his body twitching unnaturally as the growl morphed into a low, menacing laugh. The room began to spin, the lights flickering erratically, and Claire felt something cold and dark wrap itself around her mind. When they returned home, nothing was the same. Mark was a shell of the man he had once been, his eyes hollow, his voice monotone. The children barely spoke, their eyes haunted by things no one could see. And Claire, though she tried to hold the family together, felt the darkness in every corner of their home. Every whisper of wind sounded just like the hotel's chilling voice. No one else could feel it. No one believed her when she said that the presence from the Lancaster Hotel had followed them home. It was with them now, always. And it was only a matter of time before it claimed them all. The Johnson family was never the same after that trip.